The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp grass and fallen leaves as Officer James Carter made his usual patrol through Willow Creek Park. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows over the empty benches, the rustling trees whispering secrets to the wind. It was supposed to be just another quiet night until he saw her. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he drew closer, he could see a small figure curled up on one of the benches, barely visible under the dim glow. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, hugged her knees to her chest, her face hidden behind strands of unkempt hair. She wore a thin hoodie that was far too light for the chilly night, and her shoes were scuffed, as if she had been running for miles. James's heart clenched. He had been on the force long enough to know when something wasn't right. A child alone in the park this late at night? That was a red flag if he'd ever seen one. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently, crouching to her level. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl flinched at the sound of his voice. She looked up, and that was when he saw it, the tear tracks staining her cheeks, the raw redness of her eyes. She had been crying. For how long, he couldn't tell, but the pain in her expression was unmistakable. "Hi, I can't go home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James felt a lump form in his throat. "Why not? What happened?" The girl hesitated, her tiny fingers tightening around the sleeves of her hoodie. "My dad, he doesn't know I'm gone," she admitted. "And if he finds out—" Her words trailed off, but the fear in her voice spoke volumes. James had seen enough cases to know there were a million possible reasons why a child might be too afraid to go home. Some were heartbreaking, some were terrifying, and all of them needed to be handled with care. "Okay," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated for a long moment before whispering, "Emma." "That's a beautiful name," James said with a small smile. "Emma, do you have anyone I can call? A family member, maybe. A friend?" Emma shook her head quickly. "No, there's no one." That answer sent a fresh wave of concern through him. He glanced around, as if expecting someone to step out of the darkness and claim her. But the park was silent except for the occasional chirp of crickets. She was truly alone. "All right," he said carefully. "How about this? We can sit here for a bit, and you can tell me what's going on when you're ready." No pressure. "Sound good?" Emma looked at him for a long moment, searching his face as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, she gave a small nod. James sat down on the bench beside her, giving her space but making sure she knew he wasn't going anywhere. The silence stretched between them, but he didn't rush her. Instead, he waited, watching as she wiped at her tear-streaked face with the sleeve of her hoodie. "My mom used to bring me here," she said at last, her voice small. "We'd come every Saturday, just the two of us." James listened intently, nodding but not interrupting. "She said this was our special place," Emma continued, her gaze distant. "But then she got sick, and one day she just didn't wake up." A sharp pang of sorrow hit James square in the chest. He had seen loss before, had even experienced his own share of it, but there was something especially cruel about a child losing her mother so young. "I'm so sorry, Emma," he said softly. "I can't imagine how hard that must be." Emma sniffled, her fingers gripping the fabric of her hoodie tightly. "After she was gone, everything changed. My dad, he tries, but he's not the same. He gets angry a lot. He doesn't talk about her. It's like she never existed." James felt his jaw tighten. He had seen this kind of grief before, the kind that turned into anger, the kind that made people push away the very ones they should hold close. I just wanted to visit her, Emma continued, her voice breaking. I went to her grave today, but I didn't want to go home after. I didn't want to go back to a house where no one talks about her, where it feels like she never mattered. James swallowed hard. This wasn't just about a little girl running away. This was about a child carrying the weight of her grief alone, with no one to help her bear it. You miss her, he said, and Emma nodded rapidly, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. James took a slow breath, thinking. He couldn't just leave her here. He needed to get her somewhere safe, but more than that, he needed to make sure she wasn't returning to a home where she felt invisible. Emma, he said gently, I know this is really hard, but I promise you, your mom mattered. She still does, and you don't have to go through this alone. She looked at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Can I take you somewhere warm? He asked. Someplace safe. We can talk to someone who can help. I won't make you go home if you don't feel safe there. Emma hesitated. James could see the conflict on her face, the fear of trusting a stranger versus the exhaustion of carrying everything alone. Then finally she nodded. Relief flooded through James, but he knew this was only the beginning. Emma's story was far from over, and he had a feeling there was more to it than she was letting on. As he stood and held out his hand, Emma hesitated before slipping her small fingers into his. And as they walked toward his patrol car, James couldn't shake the feeling that this night was about to uncover something much bigger than either of them had expected. Emma sat quietly in the front seat of the patrol car, her small hands resting on her lap. The soft hum of the engine filled the silence between them, but James could still feel the weight of unspoken words lingering in the air. He glanced at her every now and then, watching as she stared out the window, lost in her own world. He could tell she was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that settled deep in the bones, the kind that no child should ever have to carry. Are you cold? He asked, adjusting the heat slightly. Emma shook her head without looking at him. She was still guarded, still unsure of whether she had made the right choice by trusting him. James understood that. Trust wasn't something that came easily, especially for kids who had learned to navigate their world carefully, afraid of stepping in the wrong place. You said your dad doesn't know you're gone, he said gently, watching for her reaction. Does he usually notice when you're not home? Emma hesitated before shrugging. Sometimes, but not always. James kept his expression neutral, but inside, his worry deepened. He had been an officer long enough to recognize the signs of a child slipping through the cracks. The way Emma spoke, the way she held herself, it was like she had already convinced herself that she was invisible. I think we should talk to someone who can help, he said carefully. Not to get anyone in trouble, just to make sure you're okay. How does that sound? Emma finally turned her head to look at him. Her eyes, though still wary, held something else now, something fragile, like she wanted to believe him but wasn't sure if she could afford to. You promise I won't have to go home if I don't want to, she asked. James nodded. I promise. She studied him for a moment before giving a small nod of her own. It wasn't much, but it was a start. James pulled into the station, parking near the entrance where the lights glowed warm against the dark night. He turned off the engine and looked over at her. Come on, let's get you inside. Emma climbed out slowly, stuffing her hands into the pocket of her hoodie as she followed him inside. The station was quiet at this hour, only a few officers working late shifts. A woman at the front desk looked up as they entered, her brows lifting slightly in surprise. This is Emma, James said, keeping his voice calm and steady. She needs somewhere safe to stay tonight. The woman gave a warm smile. Hi, sweetheart. You must be tired. Would you like some hot chocolate? Emma hesitated before nodding. Come on, I'll get you settled, the woman said kindly, leading Emma toward a small lounge area. James watched her go, a part of him relieved that she was at least somewhere warm and safe for now. But another part of him knew that this was only the beginning. Something about Emma's story wasn't adding up. Her fear, her reluctance to go home, there was something she wasn't telling him. He decided to dig a little deeper. Pulling out his phone, he ran a quick search on Emma's last name, checking for any recent reports or incidents linked to her father. What he found made his stomach tighten. A few months ago, a report had been filed against Emma's father for neglect. A neighbor had called it in, saying they had seen Emma wandering alone at night more than once, looking lost and scared. But when officers checked, the father had explained it away, said Emma was just going through a hard time after her mother passed, that she liked to take late-night walks to clear her head. With no solid evidence of abuse or danger, the case had been closed. James exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Something told him that wasn't the full story. And if Emma had been out here alone again tonight, it meant nothing had changed. He walked back to the lounge, where Emma was sitting with a cup of hot chocolate in her hands, staring down at the steam rising from the cup. She didn't look up as he sat across from her. "Emma," he said gently, "can I ask you something?" She nodded without speaking. "When was the last time you felt safe at home?" Emma's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Her shoulders rose just a little, like she was bracing herself. "I don't know," she whispered. James swallowed the lump in his throat. "What happens when your dad gets angry?" Emma hesitated, then shook her head. "He doesn't hit me," she said quickly, as if she already knew what he was thinking. "He just yells. A lot. And sometimes he doesn't talk to me at all for days. He just sits in his room, and it's like I don't exist." James felt his chest tighten. Neglect could be just as damaging as anything else. A child shouldn't have to beg for love. "Did he know you were at the cemetery today?" he asked. Emma nodded slowly. "Yeah, but he didn't want to come with me. He never does. He says it doesn't change anything." James's jaw clenched. Grief was a difficult thing, and he wasn't here to judge another man's pain. But Emma's father wasn't just grieving, he was drowning in it. And in the process, he was letting his daughter sink right along with him. "You don't have to go back there tonight," James reassured her. "We're going to figure this out, okay?" Emma looked up at him, something like relief flickering in her tired eyes. "Okay." Just then, the door to the lounge opened, and another officer stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "James, we've got a situation." James stood immediately, his instincts kicking in. "What is it?" The officer hesitated before answering. Emma's father just called 911. He reported her missing. James's stomach tightened. He glanced at Emma, whose face had gone pale. "He's demanding to know where she is," the officer continued. "Says he wants her home. Now." James looked back at Emma. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her cup down. "Do I have to go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James took a slow breath, his mind racing. Legally, her father had rights. But something told him that sending Emma back tonight would be the wrong decision. "No," he said firmly. "Not until we figure out what's best for you." Emma exhaled shakily, but this time, when she looked at him, there was something new in her eyes. Hope. James turned back to the other officer. "Tell him we'll talk. But she's not going anywhere just yet." As the officer nodded and left the room, James sat back down, his mind already working through the next steps. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. James could feel the tension thick in the air as he stepped into the main office. Emma stayed behind in the lounge, but he could still feel her presence, her silent plea not to be sent back. The station phone was still active on the desk, and on the other end, a voice crackled through the speaker, low, firm, and laced with barely controlled frustration. "I need my daughter home," Emma's father said. "I don't know what she told you, but this is a mistake." James exchanged a glance with the other officer. He had heard this tone before. The defensive urgency, the attempt to regain control of a situation slipping through the cracks. But he wasn't about to be rushed. "Mr. Bennett," James said, keeping his voice calm. "Emma is safe. She showed up at the park alone tonight, and she told me she didn't feel comfortable going home. Can you help me understand why?" A long silence followed. I don't know," Mr. Bennett finally said. His voice wavered slightly. "She's been struggling since her mother passed. We both have. She just runs off sometimes when she's upset. I didn't think she'd take it this far." James leaned against the desk, considering his next words carefully. "Sir, when was the last time you really talked to her?" Another pause. "I don't know," Mr. Bennett admitted, quieter this time. "She doesn't talk much, and when she does, it's always about." He cut himself off. "About her mom," James guessed. A heavy exhale came through the line. "I just don't know how to do this without her." James sighed. He wasn't here to judge the man's grief, but Emma had spent too long living in silence, waiting for a father who wasn't emotionally present. "I understand loss, Mr. Bennett," James said, his voice softer now. "I know it can feel impossible to move forward, but Emma needs you. And right now she doesn't believe you see her anymore." A long silence stretched between them. Then for the first time, Mr. Bennett's voice cracked. "I don't know how to fix this." James glanced toward the lounge where Emma sat, staring down at her hands, waiting for a decision to be made for her. "Then let's start with tonight," James said. "Come to the station. Not to take her home, but to sit down and really talk to her. Can you do that?" There was hesitation, but then, yeah, I can do that. 15 minutes later, the station doors opened, and Mr. Bennett stepped inside. He looked exhausted, his beard unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, like he hadn't truly looked at himself in weeks. But it was his eyes that told the real story. He looked lost. James led him to the lounge, where Emma tensed the second she saw him. "Hey, sweetheart," Mr. Bennett said awkwardly, shifting on his feet. Emma's fingers curled into her hoodie. She didn't say anything. James stood by the door, giving them space but keeping watch. "I didn't know you felt this way," Mr. Bennett continued, his voice low. I thought not talking about her would help you move on." Emma finally looked up, her small frame trembling. "I don't want to move on. I want to remember her." Her father swallowed hard, his eyes glassy. "Me too." The silence stretched, but it wasn't as heavy this time. "Emma," James said gently, "you don't have to go home tonight if you're not ready. But I think your dad wants to try." Emma studied her father for a long moment. There was still hesitation in her eyes, but something had shifted. "I don't want to be invisible anymore," she whispered. Mr. Bennett knelt in front of her, his voice thick. "You're not. I promise, you're not." James exhaled, feeling the tension in the room ease just slightly. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but this was a start. Emma wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long time, she believed that. As James stepped out to give them privacy, he felt a rare sense of relief. He hadn't just found a lost girl tonight. He had helped a father and daughter find each other again.